It was the most powerful political idea in history. A new faith for a skeptical age. It promised a world of harmony and abundance, if only property was shared by all and distributed equally. The idea was called socialism, and it spread farther and faster than any religion in history. Then, in almost the blink of an eye, it all collapsed. What happened? In this series, we trace the rise and fall of an idea that changed the world, an idea that promised a heaven right here on Earth.
The early 19th century brought with it a faith in limitless human progress. Old beliefs rooted in religion and superstition were abandoned in favor of new ones, supposedly based on science and rational thought. One of these new ideas was called socialism. Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. Welcome to Heaven on Earth, a think tank special. In this hour, a British reformer creates a model utopia on the American frontier. Soon, two German philosophers recast the idea as prophecy, arguing that socialism is the world's destiny. And as the 20th century begins, a Russian revolutionary sets out to fulfill the prophecy at any cost, including mass murder, while peaceful reformers across Europe and North America respond very differently to socialism's call. And so we begin in America. The United States is not yet 50 years old. Land in the West is plentiful, a magnet to new settlers and to new ideas.
Indiana, 1825. A great experiment was unfolding on the banks of the Wabash River. It was called New Harmony, and it would be a community of equality, heralding a new way of life, and eventually a new kind of world. Its founder was a British industrialist named Robert Owen, and his followers would soon coin a name for his vision: socialism. When Robert Owen arrived in America, he was already famous for his progressive ideas. His cotton mill in New Lanark, Scotland, was the most heralded industrial enterprise of its day. He shortened working hours, restricted child labor, and even provided sick pay. And Owen not only cared about how his 2,000 employees worked, he cared about how they lived.
Anyone who would live in his properties there at New Lanark had to live by his rules, and they were very specific. How often they had to put out their trash, how often they had to bathe, when people needed to be home at night, the fact that they couldn't be publicly drunk, they had to spend time with their families, those kinds of things.
Education was a key part of Owen's reforms. Rather than putting his employees' children to work in the factory, he put them in school. He also created the first preschool in the United Kingdom. It was part of what he called the Institute for the Formation of Character. Owen was developing a theory of human nature that would remain one of the fundamental ideas of socialism. It would resurface again and again.
He felt you could actually mold human character, and he in fact said it is of all truths the most important, that man's character is made for, not by himself. So he's an environmental determinist, and he believes that if you can begin virtually at birth and have this child in a superior environment, then you will, through education and liberation of this person's intellect and spirit, you will actually produce a perfect character.
He called this the second coming of the truth. I think he really did believe he was the second Messiah, that he had come, unlike Jesus, who could only tell the truth in parables. Owen, on the other hand, could actually say the literal truth because he had the science.
People took Owen seriously. When he arrived in America in 1825, a joint session of Congress was convened to hear his ideas. Before an audience that included President James Monroe and President-elect John Quincy Adams, Owen announced he had purchased an entire village in Indiana. There, he would further the work begun at New Lanark. But this time, his community would be one of true equality. Harmony, Indiana was founded a decade earlier as a different kind of commune, a religious one. Owen bought it from George Rapp, the charismatic leader of a sect of German Lutherans who were pulling up stakes to follow one of Rapp's visions. They left behind 160 buildings and some 30,000 acres of fertile land.
If you think of Indiana at that time period, it was the wilderness. And here in the middle of the wilderness, you had this beautiful town of brick and clapboard houses, a magnificent cruciform church in the middle of town in the commons. It was very sophisticated. It was called the Athens of the West at that time.
On April 27, 1825, Robert Owen welcomed 800 eager arrivals to the town he had rechristened New Harmony. One group in particular was attracted to New Harmony: intellectuals. The village soon became a center of progressive thought and experiment.
You had education at all levels, from infant to adult education. You had a newspaper being published. You had natural scientists out exploring the environs of New Harmony and beyond, creating natural science books to show people about the wonderful new species they're finding in the Midwest. You had people lecturing about equal rights for women. You had people lecturing about abolition. This was in 1827, 1828.
To coincide with the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in July 1826, Owen issued what he saw as the next step in the liberation of humankind: the Declaration of Mental Independence. From here forward, he proclaimed, man was free from the trinity of evils responsible for all the world's misery and vice: traditional religion, conventional marriage, and private property. The last of these was key. The quest to do away with private property would animate socialism for the next 150 years.
I think that Robert Owen arrived slowly at the conclusion that it was individual property and individual profit that was, in a sense, undermining the opportunities to create a new society. That inequalities in society were created by inequalities in the ownership of property and in the ownership of wealth and profit.
Owen couldn't quite bring himself to turn over ownership of his property to the community, but people did get to live there for free. All goods were distributed at the village store. It was not the most efficient system. One New Harmony member named Paul Brown wrote that even salads were deposited in the store to be handed out, making 10,000 unnecessary steps and causing them to come to the tables in a wilted, deadened state. Before long, many members were losing their enthusiasm for the experiment.
In the end, I think one of the problems in New Harmony was that it was a big group of idealists in one place, in a very isolated place. They spent a lot of time thinking about the ideal of the perfect community. Ultimately, you had a lot of thinkers and not enough doers.
The work simply didn't get done. Before long, industries that had thrived under George Rapp's followers were either sputtering or out of business altogether. After 2 years, several reorganizations, and 7 different constitutions, Owen's great experiment collapsed.
Owen had a very hard time acknowledging that there was a failure at New Harmony, and through a period of many months when everyone around him, including his sons, was saying things are falling apart, Owen was saying things are going great here. But eventually he couldn't keep up that pretense any longer because everyone was leaving. And so Owen found a kind of alibi, I think, in blaming the people who came to New Harmony as being poor human material for his experiment.
Owen's son Robert Dale stayed at New Harmony after its collapse. He had a different assessment of his father's experiment. He wrote, "All cooperative schemes which provide equal remuneration to the skilled and industrious and the ignorant and idle must work their own downfall. For by this unjust plan, they must of necessity eliminate the valuable members and retain only the improvident, unskilled, and vicious." Despite the failure of New Harmony and other early attempts to put socialism into practice, the idea continued to generate great excitement. Soon, 2 philosophers would take utopian hope and turn it into faith by arguing that socialism was not only desirable, it was inevitable. Back in England, Robert Owen and his followers were building gathering places for the socialist faithful. They called them halls of science. Each week, thousands of adherents of Owen's new moral world flocked there seeking inspiration.
Even though they proclaimed earnestly that they had contempt for all religion, every Sunday they would all gather and bring their families there, but they didn't call them services, they called them meetings, and then someone would get up in the front and do something that sounded like a sermon, but they called it a lecture, and then they would all sing from a special book of socialist hymns, except they wouldn't sing about God and goodness, they would sing about equality and brotherhood.